Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Well, today I am really excited to kick off a series that we're going to be doing for the next few podcasts on the Enneagram and how we see those tendencies in the different types and personality profiles within the Enneagram, how that impacts our stewardship decisions. How do we end up using God's resources to medicate some of the pain that we see across those different personality types? The Enneagram, if you're not familiar with it, is a really popular personality typing system. There's nothing magical about it. There's nothing unique about it in terms of how it explains our styles. A lot of things like Myers-Briggs and some of the other personality typing systems that are out there have a lot of overlap on the Enneagram. But I'm a fan of the Enneagram. I know there's a lot of controversy sometimes around these different personality systems. But the one thing I really like about the Enneagram that I find unique is this movement that it describes towards a stress response. Where do we go when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel stressed? What does it look like for us to get less healthy in that personality type? And then what does it look like to move towards health? What are the tendencies that would actually make us a healthier version of that type? I think that's the one thing about the Enneagram that I find unique, and I think it's a gift. I think there's a lot of compassion that I find in that Enneagram typing, because when I can understand someone's motivations, when I can understand why they do what they do, I can be less dismissive, I can be less frustrated with them, I can start to seek to meet them in some of that pain. And so if you are in a leadership position in the church, if you are talking with people who are understanding of the Enneagram, sometimes it's helpful to match up their style with the way that they're interacting with God's resources. And a lot of times this comes out in marriages as well. If you see a 2 that's married to a 7, for example, how are they going to interact differently? And a lot of the arguments that they'll find around money are rooted in those approaches that they have in their personality types. And so we're going to just go one by one in the styles of the Enneagram, the types. We're going to explain really briefly what they are, but then we're going to unpack what's motivating them and actually how they end up showing up, and some of the money mistakes they might tend towards, some of the ways that they might over-prioritize certain things to the detriment of their stewardship, and how they might be able to move towards more health in those areas. And so if you are an Enneagram fan, I think you'll love this series we're about to do. If you are unfamiliar with the Enneagram, if you've never heard of it before, I would encourage you to go check some resources out. There's a great resource, the EnneagramInstitute.com. Enneagram is spelled Enneagram, very strange word. But if you go to that website, they give you all the different types. You can kind of see what they are like, and probably one of them will jump out from the page, and you'll be able to say, oh, that sounds a lot like me. And so we're going to start by just going through the different triads. There's 9 different personality types. If you have not dug into the Enneagram, there's basically 9 different types. They're really broken into 3 subsections, what they call the triads. And those are basically an interesting reflection of what motivates those 3 types. So we're going to start, ironically, with 2, 3, and 4. Instead of starting at 1, because 1's in a different triad, we're actually going to start with 2, 3, and 4. And type 2, 3, and 4 are the helper, what's traditionally called the achiever, and the individualist. And so those 3 types in that triad, the 2, 3, and the 4, are all generally motivated by their heart, and they are generally wrestling with and trying to solve for their shame. And so the thing that's really fascinating about all of these triads as we go through them is we'll see a very interesting pattern emerge. Each of these different types are going to express themselves with that shame motivation. I want to fix my shame problem in this particular triad externally. I want to mask it, cover it up, act like it's not there, or I take it internal. And you'll see that in each of the triads. The anger triad, there is an external. That typically is the 8. There's the masking, which would be the 9. And then there's the internal kind of self-judgment and self-loathing that comes from the perfectionist, which is the 1. And so as we go through that, you're going to see this pattern is really interesting. In the fear triad, we see the 5, the 6, and the 7. The 5 is internal. The 6 is kind of masking and covering up their fear, and the 7 is handling it by going outside of themselves. And so this pattern is really helpful because when we can see how this works, we can start to understand why some of the decisions that we make, some of the motivations that we're dealing with will move us in these very consistent directions. And it actually gives us a very clear help to understand what it looks like to move towards a healthier version of that personality type. So let's start with type 2. Type 2 is the helper. They are incredible humans. They are constantly self-sacrificial. They are always looking for ways to help others. And when we think about that motivation for them to help others, it's mostly rooted in if they can help enough people in enough ways, they can somehow prove themselves worthy of love, that they're valuable, then they can fight that sense of shame that they're wrestling with by overcoming it externally. So in this triad of the shame triad, or what some people call the heart triad, you are seeing that 2 take that shame and go outside, help other people, be so self-sacrificial, completely disregard any of their own personal needs in order to meet the needs of others. And when we see that external motivation, that movement to just cover their shame by having everyone love them for all that they do for them, that 2's motivation can really get confused. All of a sudden, that 2, that helper, sees helping as their only form of value. And so they will wear themselves out. They will pour themselves out to an extreme level. And many times they will actually get to where they resent all the helping that they're providing. And so the ultimate irony is that they will say yes to everything, they will take on everything, and then they will hate that they did all of that. They will turn very, very angry by all the stuff they've taken on, which is why a lot of times you'll see in the Enneagram that the 2 moves to an 8 when they get stressed. 8 is a very outward anger kind of style. And so they will become very angry at all the stuff they've said yes to. They will also completely ignore their own needs and their own wants in order to meet everyone else's needs and wants. And what happens more often than not is we will see this translate in their stewardship. They will overcommit, they will overburden themselves by taking care of everyone else's burdens. We see this a lot in parenting styles. The 2 will tend to care for and alleviate any and all pain that their kids might be experiencing. And so they will pay for everything. They will make sure their college is covered. They will go way above and beyond making sure that those children are cared for and never experience discomfort, even if it means that they experience extreme discomfort themselves. This is where we see people prioritizing college costs being covered and not actually taking care of their own retirement because they're so focused on other people's needs that they'll ignore their own. And so from a financial standpoint, we'll see 2s get way overextended in their giving, in their generosity. Anyone who asks them to support them, they will say yes to all of those things. We will see them overextended in the ways that they are supporting other people's lifestyles, rescuing them from their own pain. And so you'll see a lot of 2s will co-sign for other people's debt. They will pay off other people's costs. They will cover the needs of other people, and they will ignore the fact that they also need to take care of themselves. And so one of the things we'll see in marriages oftentimes is if a 2, for example, is married to a 7, like I said earlier, that tension comes out in that the 2 is very others focused, very interested in helping everybody else. The 7 is very interested in enjoying life and doing all the fun. The 7 is the enthusiast. And so we'll see this argument that's very consistent in marriages when the 2 is saying we should help them and them and them and them and them. And the 7 is saying, but what about me? I want to have fun. I want to spend money on myself. In any of these types, these combinations, we will tend to see different combinations come together and their motivations are opposing each other. And so the 2 is very focused on caring for and overcoming other people's pain, even if it destroys themselves. What we see is the move towards an interest in their own needs. And in the Enneagram language, what that means is when we move towards health, we're moving towards a 4 when we're a 2. The 4 is the individualist. They're very interested in their own needs. They're very thoughtful. They go very inward. And so the 2 needs to get more inward, needs to be thinking more about what they need and what they're feeling and what it looks like for them to take care of themselves, because they are worthy of being taken care of. They are worthy of being interested in their own needs and wants. They need to get to a place where they're not looking for validation to overcome their shame by everyone thinking they're great because of all the help they provide. Getting to a place where they actually realize they are valuable and they are worthy of taking care of their own needs and wants without having to get that worthiness from all the help they're providing for other people. And so if you are a 2 and you have been struggling with getting way overcommitted and way out over your skis, both with your time management as well as with your finances, one of the most important things you can do as a 2 is give yourself the space to ask the question, what do I want? What do I need? And start to recognize how these never-ending pursuits of meeting other people's needs are getting in the way of taking care of what you need for yourself. The next personality type is the 3, and that's typically called the achiever. And this is the one that masks their underlying motivations. So the 3 is still filled, again, in this triad with shame. But the way they overcome that shame is by covering it with achievements and accolades and awards. And so when we tend to see the 3, they are very competitive. They're very status oriented. They want the title at the job that they're in. They want to get to the top of the top. They want to be the most successful athlete or the most successful business person or the most successful teacher or lawyer or whatever they're putting their hand to. They need to win the awards, have the ribbons and the trophies in order to prove to themselves that they don't need to be ashamed of themselves. So they're trying to cover it up. They're not actually motivated in that, like the helper, in winning everyone else's affection. They're actually motivated in winning and proving to themselves that they are successful and they are valuable and they are worthy of love and they don't need to feel that shame. And the problem with the 3 is they will win at all costs, including their own sanity, their own health. They will put success and achievement above rest and self-care, because it's more important that they win the trophy and prove that they are successful and talented and worthy of love than it is that they actually take care of themselves. And so when we see that 3 striving, fighting to get more, what we tend to see is that the 3 will overcome their shame by looking at what they've accomplished. And so that translates a lot into how they tend to spend their resources, right? We'll see the 3 generally wanting to live in the certain neighborhood, in the certain house, driving the certain car, having the certain job title, getting to a certain income level. All of those things are rooted in being able to prove to themselves that they're worthy. And so these tend to be a lot of times what we would call, in good sense lingo, relentless earners. They're very successful. They are very good at the work that they do, and they do a lot of it. They will work very unbalanced lives in order to achieve the highest levels of whatever they put their hand to. And so when we see this achievement focus, we tend to also see them wanting the trophies. And a lot of times those look like the car that they drive, the house that they live in, the school that their kids go to. They're seeing their identity and their status in their stuff and in their social circle. They are very interested in being the best. And that is not actually because they are truly just selfish and self-absorbed. It is actually them trying to escape the shame that is embedded in them. One of the things that's really interesting about the 3 is that when we think about that move towards health, it is really a sense of getting to a place where they get more aware of the shame that's motivating all of that striving. And they start to get more content with not being the best or going the farthest or having the biggest. They actually get to a place where they can start to be still and know that God is absolutely over the moon in love with them, that they don't need to prove anything, that they can just be in their own skin without trophies or awards or titles, and they can actually move at a slower pace that's more sustainable and more comfortable. One of the things that's so hard about this particular personality type is that the world rewards it. There is an incredible tendency, particularly in the US, to celebrate and prize achievers. And so they don't actually see any of this as a flaw. They don't tend to get to a place where they see how unhealthy this pace is, how unhealthy this relentless competition is. Because everywhere they look, they see accolades and awards and celebrations for what they're achieving. And so a lot of times it is kind of this movement inward. In the Enneagram case, this would be a movement towards a 6, where they're getting more aware of what it means to actually be safe and secure. And they are more focused on others, those closest to them, rather than their own achievements and their own accolades. They start to get more oriented towards deep connection, and they get to a place of contentment. And so if you are a 3, or you're working with a 3, or you're married to a 3, one of the things that's really helpful for a 3 is defining very specifically what is enough. Where are we drawing the line? You could always do more. You could always go bigger. You could always win more. But if we don't draw a line, you will destroy yourself in that pursuit. One of the things that I find so fascinating in the first chapter of the book of James, James talks about this idea that a rich man will lose himself in all of his pursuits, that he will fade away in the pursuits of all these things. And I think that hits so directly for a 3. And so a 3 needs to get to a place where they can sit in more stillness, draw lines that say this far, no further. Things like the lifestyle cap and the non-negotiables get really, really helpful for people who are striving for more all the time, to get to a place where they can start to tell themselves the truth that they don't actually need more, that they don't need to prove themselves worthy with all these achievements. They can stop here and live a life that's more steady and content and sustainable. Let's talk about the 4. The 4 is one of my favorite personality types. They're also one of the most complicated. The 4 is called traditionally the individualist. They love being unique. And so as we saw in the 2, this outward expression of trying to fix their shame problem, we see the 3 is trying to mask that shame problem. The 4, that individualist, is taking it internal. They take their shame and they process it internally. They tend to be very emotional. They tend to be very melancholy. A lot of times they can be sometimes the Eeyore in the room. They do tend to move towards sadness and depression and can be kind of gray about themselves. And their response to their shame is to take it even further and get deeper into that gray melancholy. And so one of the things they do to cope with that is they overcome their shame by telling themselves and telling others they're just misunderstood. They're just too different from everybody else. They're too unique. And so they don't need to feel shame about themselves because they're just different than everybody else. And that sense of difference then needs to be proven. And so we'll tend to see 4s dress in really different ways. They're very specific about their style. They'll buy very specific clothing. And I even am very close to a 4 where if we go to lunch and we're wearing something similar or we're about to leave, he'll throw on a scarf or wear something different just to be different than me because we're too close in how we look. 4s will tend to listen to very unique music, and they actually love it when the people around them don't get it because it proves that it's just that they're unique, right? They love that uniqueness. It's very important to them that they are different than everybody else. And so a lot of times with 4s, when it comes to resources, what we'll see is they will prioritize spending on things that make them stand out. And so they'll be very specific about the brands that they're buying or the styles that they're spending on or the stuff that they're into. They want to make sure that they're doing things that are different than everybody else. And a lot of times that does take a lot of resources. If you're buying these brands that are out on the cutting edge of style, or you're spending on these different hobbies that are super unique that no one else can really get into, either because they're really hard to get into, they're expensive, or they're really obscure, it does tend to mean that we spend more money on that type of stuff. we also tend to see fours bucking things that feel like I'm just like everybody else. And so we can tell fours, this is the way that you need to think about your finances. These are the ways that everybody works, and this is how we want to set it up. And they will want to fight against that tendency to be similar to everybody else. Well, that system might work for everybody else, but it doesn't work for me. I need something different. And so a lot of times they will not pay attention to their finances. They will tend to lean towards more emotional, less mathematical. And so they'll just tell themselves, everybody else can do this, but I can't because I'm unique, right? It's this fight. And so a lot of times in marriages, this will be a tension point where the four is really not interested in specifics and data and trying to get intentional with tracking and organizing, because that's the stuff that everybody else does, but that's not going to work for me because I'm unique. And that tension can get really, really frustrating, particularly if the four is married to, say, a one, the perfectionist that wants to use the exact system and know exactly where every penny is accounted for. And the four just could not care less about that type of data because they're so unique and so different than everybody else. That type of tension can get really hard to navigate in a marriage. And one of the things that's really fascinating about the four, and what I like to encourage them to consider, is the four, when they are getting more healthy, they actually move more towards a one. They actually get to a place where they see the right way to do it that everybody else is using, and they start to adopt it. They start to recognize they're not actually as different from everybody else as they would like to believe. They can still hold on to their unique styles or their unique music or whatever, but they need to start to get to a place where they adopt the systems that work for everybody. And part of that means putting down some of that uniqueness, some of that story that they're telling themselves, and moving towards a one in health looks like picking up some of that specific tracking, some of that organization, some of that what feels very familiar and commonplace. Tracking spending is what everybody does, and that feels very boring to a four. But if they can get to a place where they actually realize they aren't as different as they'd like to believe, they are actually just as human as everybody else, and they're called to the same stewardship standards, the same responsibility for God's resources as everybody else is. And so they should be using systems to track these things and understand these things and pay attention to how they're using God's resources. And so those are really important steps for a four to take, particularly when they're in a relationship with somebody who is more detail-oriented and wants that information. It's really important for the four to lay down some of that uniqueness and start to do the things that work in these areas so that they can honor God more intentionally with the resources He's given them to manage. And so one of the things that is really beautiful about the Enneagram, we'll step into the next round in the next podcast. We'll look at the 5, 6, and 7. But one of the things that's really fascinating to me is that as you hear these different numbers, as we go through these types, so today we did the helper, the achiever, and the individualist, I am pretty confident you know one of those. You may be one of those, but you certainly have relationship with someone who falls into one of those categories. And hopefully this helps you to see them in a new light, to understand what they're wrestling with, why they're motivated to do the things that they're doing. And instead of judging them or condemning them or telling them to stop being that way, the gift of the Enneagram is being able to say, I understand why you are that way. And I can see that most of what's motivating you is rooted in something that's hard and painful, and you're trying to solve that problem. And so it makes sense. And just getting to a place where you can say it makes sense is a gift to give, particularly to this triad that's motivated in shame. Because if you keep telling them what they're doing doesn't make sense, you're just putting salt in that wound of shame. And so join us next time as we dive in further to the next round of the Enneagram triads. We're going to be looking at the fear triad, also known as the head triad. We're going to look at the 5, the 6, and the 7. And we're going to, just like we did today, unpack what motivates them and how that integrates and relates to the way that we honor God with the resources He's asked us to steward on His behalf. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you.